November 1944. Warsaw, the ruins of a destroyed building. A Jewish pianist is hiding in the rubble. He's been alone for months, starving, days from death, maybe hours. And then he hears footsteps, German boots on broken concrete. A Wehrmacht officer appears in the doorway, sees him, recognizes immediately that he's Jewish. The pianist, Władysław Szpilman, thinks, "This is it. This is how I die." But instead, the officer asks a question. "What do you do for a living?" I'm a pianist." "Then play something for me." There's a destroyed piano in the corner. Szpilman sits down. His hands are shaking from starvation, and he plays Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. The officer listens in silence. When the music ends, he doesn't arrest him. He brings him food, blankets, and his own German army greatcoat so large on Szpilman's starving frame that he'd wear it for years after the war as a symbol of survival. That coat is now in a Polish museum. The officer? He died alone in a Soviet Gulag, tortured to death. His name was Wilm Hosenfeld, and he's one of only about 650 Germans out of 18 million who served, ever honored by Israel for saving Jewish lives. This is his story. Quick note. In my last video, I showed evidence that most Wehrmacht soldiers knew about the Holocaust and were complicit. The secret recordings, the photographs, the bureaucracy. Today's video isn't a contradiction. It's the exception that proves the rule, because Hosenfeld's story proves that moral choice was possible and shows us exactly what it cost the tiny minority who made that choice. Let's start with who he was. Wilm Hosenfeld. Born 1895, German, Catholic, schoolteacher before the war. And here's the uncomfortable part. He was initially enthusiastic about the Nazis. He joined the Nazi Party in 1935, believed in German nationalism, thought Hitler would restore Germany's pride after World War I. But then something changed. As the war progressed, as he was stationed in Poland and witnessed what the occupation actually meant, he became disillusioned, horrified. By 1942, he was writing in his diary. And what he wrote reveals a man wrestling with his conscience. He wrote about watching Jews being rounded up, about seeing the violence, about realizing that everything he'd believed was a lie. Here's what makes his diary so remarkable. It wasn't discovered until decades after his death, hidden among Soviet Gulag archives. When researchers finally read it, they described feeling chills at what they found. Because Hosenfeld didn't just observe the Holocaust, he condemned it, in writing, with brutal honesty about his own complicity. He wrote, "We have forfeited the right to live. All of us who are permitting such things to happen must die, together with the guilty." Think about that. A Wehrmacht captain, writing in his diary that Germans, including himself, deserved death for what they were allowing to happen. Most soldiers, as we saw in the last video, talked about these atrocities casually, joked about them, complained Germany wasn't being brutal enough. Hosenfeld wrote that he deserved to die for not stopping it. But he didn't just write, he acted, and what he did, the risks he took, would eventually cost him everything. Starting in the early 1940s, Hosenfeld began using his position to save people. He was a Wehrmacht captain, which meant he had authority, access, the ability to create documents, assign jobs, provide protection, and he used all of it to save lives. But here's what most people don't know. He didn't just save Jews. He helped Polish priests, teachers, resistance fighters, people actively fighting against Germany. He gave them forged papers, warned them of Gestapo raids, found them safe jobs. Think about that. He was helping people who were literally trying to kill German soldiers. Some of the Jews he saved, Leon Worm, given forged papers and a job as a building superintendent at a sports stadium, protected him and his family throughout the occupation. Jerzy Waldorf, a Polish resistance member. Hosenfeld warned him the Gestapo was searching for him, saved his life. And most famously, Władysław Szpilman, the pianist, Spielmann had been hiding in the ruins of Warsaw since the uprising in August 1944. The city was destroyed. No food, no water. Winter approaching. When Hosenfeld found him in November, not September, as some sources say, Spielmann weighed maybe 90 pounds. He was dying. And here's what makes the piano scene so remarkable. Hosenfeld didn't just help him because of the music, he'd already decided to help before asking Spielmann to play. The music wasn't a test, it was a moment of shared humanity. A German officer and a Jewish pianist surrounded by the ruins of a destroyed city, connecting through Chopin. For the next month, November through December 1944, Hosenfeld brought Spielmann food, blankets, and then, as Soviet forces closed in and Hosenfeld's unit prepared to evacuate Warsaw, he did something extraordinary. He took off his own German army greatcoat, the warm winter coat that could mean the difference between survival and death, and gave it to Spielmann. Then he left, knowing he'd probably never see him again, knowing the Soviets were coming, knowing what would happen to German soldiers when they arrived. But he left Spielmann with supplies, with that coat, with a chance to survive. That coat, by the way, was so large on Spielmann's emaciated frame that he wore it for years after the war. It became a symbol of survival, of an impossible act of humanity in the middle of hell. Today, it's in a Polish museum, a physical reminder that one German officer chose differently. How many people did Hosenfeld save? Recent research and survivor testimonies suggest at least 60, possibly more. Out of 18 million Germans who served in the Wehrmacht, Hosenfeld is one of fewer than 650 ever honored by Israel for saving Jewish lives. Think about that ratio. 1 in about 27,000. That's how rare his choice was. Let's be clear about the risk Hosenfeld was taking. If the SS or Gestapo had discovered what he was doing, he would have been arrested, court-martialed, almost certainly, executed for treason. Helping Jews was a capital offense in Nazi Germany, not a slap on the wrist, not a demotion, death. And it wasn't just his life at risk, it was his family. Survivors later recalled that Hosenfeld talked about his wife and children, about how what he was doing put them in danger. If he was caught, they'd suffer too. But he kept doing it anyway. And here's the critical point, the one that connects to my last video. Historians have searched for decades and found no documented cases of a German soldier executed for refusing to kill civilians. Let me repeat that. No cases of execution for refusing to participate in atrocities. The Nazis would absolutely have killed Hosenfeld for actively helping Jews. That was treason. But they wouldn't have killed him for simply refusing to hurt people. They'd have just reassigned him. Which raises the question, if Hosenfeld could save people for years, if soldiers who refused to kill were just reassigned rather than executed, why did so few make that choice? The answer, as we explored last time, is that most soldiers either believed in what they were doing or were complicit through inaction. Out of 27,000 Wehrmacht officers, only one was Hosenfeld. That's not because moral choice was impossible. It's because most people didn't choose it. Hosenfeld did. And what happened to him shows us exactly what that choice cost. January 1945. The Soviet Red Army enters Warsaw. German forces retreat. Most escape. But Hosenfeld, along with thousands of other German soldiers, is captured by Soviet troops. Now, put yourself in his position for a moment. You've spent years saving Jews, helping Polish resistance members, actively working against Nazi policies. You've risked your life dozens of times. You've put your family in danger. The war is over. The Nazis are defeated. You have a diary documenting everything you did. You have witnesses, people whose lives you saved, who can testify. Surely, when people hear what you did, you'll be recognized, freed, maybe even honored. That's not what happened. The Soviets weren't interested in sorting good Germans from bad Germans. To them, A Wehrmacht officer was a Wehrmacht officer. Hosenfeld was sent to a POW camp, interrogated harshly. Soviet investigators didn't care about his diary, didn't care about the Jews he'd saved. In 1947, he was put on trial, charged with anti-Soviet activities. The evidence against him? He'd been a Wehrmacht officer. That was enough. He was sentenced to 25 years in a Soviet labor camp. 25 years. For the crime of wearing a German uniform, even though he'd spent that time saving lives rather than taking them. And here's where it gets even more tragic. Hosenfeld wrote letters to his wife, begging her to contact the Jews he'd saved, to ask them to testify on his behalf. His wife tried. She reached out to Jewish survivors, to Leon Worm, to others, asked them to write to Soviet authorities explaining what Hosenfeld had done. They did. Multiple Holocaust survivors wrote letters testifying that Hosenfeld had saved their lives. The Soviet authorities ignored every single letter. This is important to understand. The Soviets had direct testimony from Holocaust survivors saying, "This man saved us from the Nazis." And they didn't care. Because in Stalin's Soviet Union, individual heroism didn't matter. Moral complexity didn't matter. You were German, therefore you were guilty. End of story. Meanwhile, Spielmann, the pianist Hosenfeld saved, was also trying to help. He was writing letters, making inquiries, desperately trying to find out what happened to the officer who saved his life. In 1950, he finally learned that Hosenfeld was in a Soviet camp. He tried to intervene. It was too late. Hosenfeld spent 7 years in Soviet camps, first at one camp, then transferred to another, then to Stalingrad. The conditions were brutal: forced labor, starvation rations, disease. But what killed him wasn't the conditions. It was the guards. On August 13, 1952, Wilm Hosenfeld died. The official cause, ruptured artery. But prisoners who were there testified later that he'd been beaten, tortured. The guards targeted him specifically because he was an officer. So let's be clear about what happened. Wilm Hosenfeld saved at least 60 Jewish and Polish lives, risked his life repeatedly to resist Nazi atrocities, put his family in danger to do the right thing, was captured by the Soviets, sentenced to 25 years despite testimony from those he saved, and was tortured to death by guards who didn't care about any of that. He died in 1952, 7 years after the war ended, at age 56. He never saw his wife again, never saw his children, never knew that he'd be remembered. His family struggled financially after the war. They faced social stigma both for his association with the Nazi regime and for being labeled a traitor by some Germans who thought he'd betrayed his country. They were stuck in the worst of both worlds, condemned by some for being German, condemned by others for not being German enough. And for decades, nobody knew what Hosenfeld had done. Here's a fact that will make you angry. Władysław Spielmann wrote his memoir in 1946, right after the war. It was called The Pianist, and it told the story of his survival, including the German officer who saved him. The book was published. But then, something happened. Poland fell under Soviet control, Stalinist regime, and the communist authorities banned the book. Why? Because it portrayed a German officer sympathetically. Under Stalin, that was unacceptable. Germans were the enemy. Period. No nuance, no complexity, no stories about good Germans saving Jews. So Spielmann's book, the book that told Hosenfeld's story, was suppressed, went out of print, forgotten. For 52 years, the story was buried. It wasn't until 1998, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that the book was republished in Poland. And even then, it took a Hollywood movie to make the world pay attention. In 2002, director Roman Polanski himself, a Holocaust survivor, turned Spielmann's memoir into a film. It starred Adrian Brody. It was called The Pianist. The movie won 3 Academy Awards. including Best Director and Best Actor. It became famous worldwide. And suddenly, millions of people knew Spielmann's story, which meant they also knew about the German officer who saved him. That's when people started asking, what happened to Hosenfeld? Spielmann's son, Andrei, began campaigning for recognition, pushing Polish and Israeli authorities to honor the man who saved his father. In 2007, Poland awarded Hosenfeld the Order of Polonia Restituta posthumously. In 2009, 57 years after Hosenfeld's death, Yad Vashem officially recognized him as righteous among the nations. This is Israel's highest honor for non-Jews who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. Hosenfeld's surviving children attended the ceremony. His son said, "My father would have been proud, but he would also have said he was just doing what any decent person should do." But here's the thing. Most people didn't do what any decent person should do. Let me put this in perspective. From 1933 to 1945, approximately 18 million Germans served in the Wehrmacht. Of those 18 million, Yad Vashem has honored fewer than 650 as righteous among the nations. That's about 1 in 27,000. And most of those 650 weren't Wehrmacht officers. They were civilians, businessmen, doctors, people with some degree of distance from the military machine. Wehrmacht officers who actively saved Jews, even rarer. Hosenfeld is one of a tiny handful. We're talking dozens out of millions. Compare that to what we saw in the last video. The British recordings of thousands of German POWs casually discussing atrocities. The photographs soldiers mailed home. The bureaucratic reports distributed in 40 copies. Most soldiers knew, most participated or looked away. Hosenfeld represents the fraction of 1% who chose differently. And that tiny fraction proves something crucial. Moral choice was possible. If it was impossible, there'd be 0 Hosenfelds. But there are some, which means the others, the vast majority, could have made the same choice. They just didn't. Here's the final bitter irony of Hosenfeld's story. In my last video, I showed you Wehrmacht soldiers talking casually about atrocities in secretly recorded conversations. Soldiers who participated in massacres, who photographed executions and mailed them home. Most of those soldiers survived the war, went home, lived normal lives, raised families. Many never faced consequences for what they did. The man who actively saved lives, he was tortured to death in a Soviet Gulag. That's not justice. That's not karma. That's just the brutal reality of how history works sometimes. The perpetrators often escape. The heroes often pay the price. But here's what's important. Hosenfeld's choice still mattered. Not because it saved him. It didn't. Not because it was recognized in his lifetime. It wasn't. But because the people he saved lived and told his story and made sure the world remembered. Leon Worm survived, had a family. Władysław Spielmann survived, became a famous pianist again, had a son who campaigned for Hosenfeld's recognition. 60 people lived who would have died. And one of them, Spielmann, made sure that 50 years later, when a Hollywood director decided to tell his story, the German officer who saved him wasn't forgotten. That greatcoat in the Polish museum, that's not just cloth. That's proof that one man chose humanity when everyone else chose hatred, and that choice echoes forward, forever. So, the Nazi officer who saved dozens. Wilm Hosenfeld wasn't a saint. He initially supported the Nazis. He wore a Wehrmacht uniform for years, but when he saw what that uniform represented, he chose to resist. In the only way available to him, by saving individual lives, one person at a time. He saved at least 60 people, risked his life repeatedly, put his family in danger, not for glory, not for recognition, just because it was the right thing to do. And he paid the ultimate price, not at the hands of the Nazis he defied, but at the hands of the Soviets who didn't care about his defiance. He died in 1952, alone, tortured, thinking the world had forgotten. But Spielmann remembered and told his story, and now millions know his name. Hosenfeld proved that moral choice was possible, even in the Wehrmacht, even in Nazi-occupied Poland, even when everyone around you is complicit. Out of 27,000 Wehrmacht officers, he was one. One in 27,000 chose what he chose, which means the other 26,999 could have. They just didn't. And if we ever face that choice, if we ever live in a time when the world demands we look away from atrocity, we need to be the one, no matter the cost, because Hosenfeld's greatcoat is still in that museum, still symbolizing survival, still proving that one person's choice can echo forward through generations. And maybe that's enough. Hosenfeld died in a Soviet Gulag, but his legacy lives on through the people he saved, what other unsung heroes of World War II deserve to be remembered. Let me know in the comments. And subscribe to the Dictator Lab for more stories about the individuals who chose courage when the world chose cruelty.